So today, Scott Ritter is back in the news. Scott Ritter has been on the pro-Russia side of the Ukraine-Russian war, and he parrots a lot of what is said in Russia. Now, I'm going to be incredibly fair to him and just give an alternative to what's going on. But I want you to see here, if you're a big Scott Ritter fan, he's writing this article in RT. That's Russia Today. It is a state-run operation in Russia, state journalism. And this isn't the first time either. He has, if you type in Scott Ritter, you'll see more than 300 results where they're either highlighting what he's saying, interviewing him, or somehow he's involved in an RT article for whatever he's saying. So they love Scott Ritter in Russia. Now that should make you ask a question whether that's a good or bad thing. And if you're thinking that that's a good thing, that Russia loves Scott Ritter, well, okay, just stay with me. So here he's saying, waging the peace, how a tour of Russia showed me that propaganda perverts reality in the minds of Americans. He said he had a month-long tour of the country, and it was an eye-opening experience, and so was the hostility that met me back home. Now, he's used to this hostility. He's been dealing with it before he left. While the official purpose of the visit was business, he was promoting his book, Disarmament Race, which has been published in Russian language, and I was going to dig deeper into the Russian history, get a better grasp of the culture, and in the process try to understand the Russian soul. Now, again, he's writing in RT, and so that's going to sound, hey, that's going to resound very well in RT. Now, he already is married to a woman that he met in the former Soviet Union. I believe it was Georgian, but he already has sympathetic leanings toward the Russians. And if you want to know anything about that, you just go back to this video, Major Scott Ritter. Well, there's a number of videos. That one, or documenting Scott Ritter, or who is Scott Ritter. I talked about Scott Ritter a number of times. And documenting Scott Ritter, I try to unpack his background and show you why he thinks the way he does. He'll talk a lot about Russophobia. I would think that Scott Ritter is a Russophile. Like, he can't see those things that are wrong with Russia. And this is why I say, this is my claim, I don't think Scott Ritter is lying. Scott Ritter's not lying. He believes this stuff. Now, he is making bank, right? The book resulted in the initial print of a run of 10,000 books. So he's making money in this process, but I believe he's a true believer, and that's the scary thing. So throughout this considerable interaction I had with Russians of all walks of life, I came away with a deeper insight into the complexity of what comprises the modern Russian nation 2023. When Victoria, that's his daughter, and I were pulled off the plane when they got back to America, to the checkpoint for an hours-long interrogation by investigators of the Customs and Borders Protection who specialize in travelers designated nations such as Russia. In short, my interrogation quickly became a debate between myself on one hand and a combination of Alexei Navalny, the imprisoned Russian opposition figure who most of the Russian dissidents support, according to the officer, and the Ukrainian government on the other. Virtually every point I made was immediately defined as pro-Russian propaganda. Well, that's probably because it was something that sounded like pro-Russian talking points. In the end, my arguments and the facts that they were based on were categorized as Kremlin talking points no matter how I tried. That's because you're saying essentially the same kind of thing as what the Russians are saying, and that's why it's categorized that way. Now he's talking about he was being interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist then turned to the age-old tactic of bringing up a past criminal conviction as a way of defining me and by extension my trip. Now, I got a lot of heat for this because when I talked about it, I intentionally omitted that because I want to take on his arguments, not just poison the water with that. And a lot of people push back on me about that, but I'm happy to bludgeon his arguments instead of deal with that criminal conviction. It's there. You can look it up. I don't need to deal with it in order to point out how other things are wrong. This apparently is what passes for journalism in America today. Scott, not with me. I'm happy to say you're wrong on for many other reasons, and we can do that and have an intellectually honest conversation. The mainstream media will continue to do this. This is what has passed for many years now, mindlessly echoing the official narrative and undermine anyone who dares to challenge it. Now, Ritter has a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but it's only balanced by the chip on his other shoulder. And part of that is he believes that he's right, and he believed that he was right when he was kind of pushing back against General Schwarzkopf, or when he was a missile inspector, nuclear weapons inspector, and he was pushing back against the U.S. government. And I showed you the video where Biden, as then a U.S. senator, was pushing back against him and saying, look, you don't have the right to tell us, to dictate U.S. policy. Now, Biden wasn't kind to him, but he has chips on his shoulder because of this. And he really is more hostile to the U.S. than he is to Russia. Upon my return home, I was able to access my email account and intramural discussion among people I respect who possess similar professional backgrounds and anti-war inclinations. Some amongst this group insisted that Putin had no choice but to act. No doubt they said that, right? While others argued that there were always options. Save for a very few exceptions, the underlying analysis was conducted from an American point of view, with little or no regard as to what would be politically possible in Russia. Byproduct of this, and he talks about Senator Lindsey Graham, who made a comment about the best money we ever spent, and he was talking about how it's hate-filled rhetoric. Well, no, it actually is the best money that the U.S. government ever spent in degrading an adversary who is fighting with a neighbor in an unprovoked kind of way. My work is cut out for me. I am also encouraged by the support. Now listen to this. Where is he going? It's not the mainstream media. No, no, no. Well, I'm also encouraged by the support that exists in the world of social media, where ideas that challenge the official narrative are freely exchanged, generating momentum that has the potential to shape minds and attitudes of a significant number of my fellow Americans. So he knows what he's doing. He's intentionally spreading these what's classified as talking points. He doesn't say that they are, but essentially he's saying the same kind of thing. And he's doing it on social media, and he is making bank. He's making money with his videos, he's making money with his books, and that's okay to be making money, but he's doing it for kind of a bad reason. But he really believes this. So I don't think he's just scamming, and that's the frightening thing. This war against Russophobia was never going to be an easy one, but for the sake of the future of America, Russia, and the rest of the world, it's one that must be won. Okay. Well, with that, let's turn to what he actually said during his month-long trip. So here's Ritter 2 weeks ago speaking at an event. He is going to be answering questions from the press, the Russian press, and, well, you can see for yourself how he thinks. Just look at him and think, who does he love? Who does he despise? How does he come off? And remember, I believe that he is not lying. I believe that he really believes what he is saying. To lie, you have to disbelieve something. He is not telling the truth necessarily, but he's not lying in the sense that he's not faking it. Okay, so here we go. Today we have an interesting guest, Scott Ritter. He's a well-known independent, political and military expert on international relations, U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, former UN's weapon inspector. He's widely known in the world and in Russia, particularly to the Russian viewing audiences. He often comes out with political analysis and commentary about current political topics. Right now, Mr. Ritter is touring Russian cities. Today, he is with us in Kazan.
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for coming today. It's an honor and a privilege to have an opportunity to speak with you. I spent 5 years of my life doing nothing but training how to kill Russian soldiers. And then we signed this treaty. And instead of training to kill Russian soldiers, they sent me to the Soviet Union to learn to work together with the Russian people. And over the course of 2 years, I learned to stop wanting to kill Russians and instead learn to like Russians.
Yeah, and he really did learn to like Russians.
Transition.
That's a very true statement. He has learned to like Russians, and he likes them a lot.
Transformation. So I'm eternally grateful for Alexander Zuryanov of the Investment Development Agency of Novosibirsk, and for everybody who's helped bring me to Russia to have an opportunity to present this book to you. Back in the 1980s, we Americans were afraid of Russia. We didn't understand Russia. So the key is getting Americans and Russians to meet together and learn about each other. As I said, that
And there was a reason for that. In the Soviet era, the Russians were a clear enemy. It's not wasn't the case until very recently with Russia itself, but the Soviet Union was a clear enemy.
process took a Marine who was solely focused on killing Russians and turned him into somebody who wanted to be friends with Russians. Now, we can do this through new arms control, or we can do this through economic cooperation, or we can do this simply by having people meet with people. In America, we have a huge problem, which we call Russophobia.
Well, okay, it's not a huge problem. It's a problem from Ritter's perspective because he can't seem to understand or wrap his head around why people don't share his opinion, and there's a pretty clear reason for it. The Russians are widely viewed as aggressors within the United States.
We are afraid of Russia. But the
No,
reason
it's
we're
not
afraid of
afraid.
Russia is that we're ignorant about Russia. So
It's not ignorant and it's not fear. It's really not. But this is the way that he sees things. And I want you to understand, he really does see things this way. He really is thinking that this is the root of the problem.
the best vaccine for this disease is to learn about Russia, which is one of the reasons why I'm here. I'm meeting with you, I'm meeting with the people of Kazan, I'm meeting with the people of Russia, and I'm learning new experiences. I'm learning about you, about your culture, about your religion, about your soul. And then
In fairness, this is a really good strategy, generally speaking, to learn about your opponent, to understand them. But the Russians aren't his opponent. The Russians, in his mind, are somehow a victim. And that's a very different place to be. So he's kind of crossed the bridge from wanting to understand them to identifying with them and being fully in their corner. I'm fully in Ukraine's corner. I'll put my cards on the table. So just understand, he really means this.
I'm going to go back to America and I'm going to meet with my fellow Americans and talk to them about Russia.
And he
It's
is.
the first step in a long journey, but it's a journey we have to take because the consequences of not taking this journey are severe.
Thank you so much. Спасибо. Вы сказали, что ваша книга издается также в США.
You said your
Можете
book was
пояснить,
also
каким тиражом
published?
она издается в США,
What a
каким
number of
в России и
copies
где лучше идут продажи?
that are published in the US versus Russia, and where is it selling better?
Я не знаю. I don't know. Where's the Комсомольская правда rep?
I bet you it sells
I
better in
think
Russia.
I don't know how many books were initially printed, and I don't know what the sales rate is. So it's not my business. I understand that based upon the reception it's received, that it's being popularly received in Russia. In the United States, when the book was published, the publisher didn't believe it was going to be a popular book. I think they only printed 500 copies to start. I don't know the final sales numbers, but I think in the United States, this message is starting to catch on. But I think the Russians are doing a better job of rolling the book out than my American publisher did.
So I don't believe that it's
Wants to
true that the
sustain
message is
its
really
role.
catching on in any meaningful way in the United States. He is working hard at it. He's doing lots of interviews, but I don't think it's really catching on like he thinks it is. But that's his perception.
Was the global hegemon, and another nation, Russia, that's ruled by a president, Vladimir Putin, whose strong desire is to let Russia stand on its own 2 feet.
So did you hear that? He just called America the global hegemon and compared Putin favorably to the United States because Putin wants Russia to stand on its own 2 feet. This is where he's coming from.
The United States would like nothing more than Vladimir Putin to transform into Boris Yeltsin. And I don't have to tell you what the 1990s were like in Russia. It was horrible. The United States controlled you economically, and we controlled you politically. Today you have a president that says, we're not going to let that happen again. And that angered.
So the United States would like a more Boris Yeltsin-like figure, but that's because the United States wants them to be peaceful and transform and let their economy grow properly. The problem is that Putin and the oligarchs grew a whole different direction than into a stable, prosperous trading partner who's not invading other nations. That's the way that most Americans will see it. Not everyone, but this is the way that he's framing the problem.
Us. And so that's the nature of the conflict today. It's not about competing ideologies, it's about survival, the survival of Russia. Because we don't want a strong Russia. We want a weak Russia.
And now that's largely true. I mean, not just from Scott. I think that's very true for many Americans who are on the other side of the fence. They want a weak Russia so that Russia won't go and tyrannize its neighbors again, because they're seeing Ukraine being victimized by Russia right now, and they think Moldova's probably next.
The nature of our conflict. I don't believe Russia wants a war.
Now that I don't understand. He believes that Russia doesn't want a war, but are what was forced into it, because he's essentially just repeating the Russian state media line. And he is in full agreement with Russian state media and Vladimir Putin's talking points. And you hear it when you hear him interview.
It really shows that Russia's reacting to an American
provocation. And that's the line.
Let's talk about Ukraine. If it weren't for Russian nuclear weapons, this war in Ukraine would be a completely different war.
And he's right about that, because Russia has actually deterred the West very well for many months, and that's why you had the slow buildup of weapons in Ukraine. It wasn't all at once.
Russian nuclear weapons are the only thing to keep the United States and NATO from directly being involved in Ukraine.
He's correct. What do you think about the journalistic community in your country?
Today, the press has become the voice of the government. I have a good friend, some of you may know his name, Seymour Hersh.
Okay, now that's interesting. I did a video about Seymour Hersh not too long ago. So Seymour Hersh was somebody who was claiming, here, Hersh said Zelensky stole $400 million, and he didn't really cite his source. He said an unknown source somewhere in the depths of his sources. And Seymour Hersh was a legitimate reporter. Many years ago, he broke My Lai massacre, but like Scott Ritter, he also can't seem to find anything he likes about the United States. He always sees corruption and terrible things. It's kind of like the economist who predicted 14 of the last 3 recessions. He got them right on 3, but the other 14, they weren't actually there. So Seymour Hersh is, Scott Ritter just called him a good friend. These guys are kind of cut out of a similar cloth.
American investigative journalist. He made his reputation uncovering the darkest secrets of the American government, because the government can have no secrets from the American people. But today, Seymour Hersh can't get published anywhere in America.
Well, there's a reason for that.
Houses don't want to uncover the darkest secrets in it. They've all aligned themselves with the government. Journalism is dead in America.
Well, so that's hardly true. Now, figure on this irony. He's speaking in Russia, and he was just doing this paper that waging the peace in RT, Russian state media, and he's talking about how journalism in the United States, where there's a free press, where anybody can really say whatever they want as long as they can find a place to publish it, is dead. And so he really has an anti-American slant to him and a very pro-Russian slant, and that's where he's coming from when he's saying the things that he's saying. So I'm just trying to be fair and show you what he's saying and why.
Sorry to say that there is no real journalism left alive in America today.
Вы не боитесь, что после путешествия
Okay, do you ever fear that they'll come after you after your trip, after your visits?
Могут быть ужесточения по отношению к вам?
I know that some European journalists
Потому что я вот, например, знаю, что некоторых европейских журналистов
have been sanctioned by their government,
применяют в отношении к ним некие санкции экономические,
economically and otherwise. For example, Graham Phillips from Great Britain was sanctioned.
Am I afraid? No. Am I worried? Yes. You're 100% correct. Speaking out against the policy of the American government oftentimes results in the powers of the American government to be turned on you. In America, we have a saying, "This isn't my first rodeo," meaning I've been through this before. When I resigned from my position as a United Nations weapons inspector, a very senior CIA official told me straight to my face that if I speak out against American policy, the FBI will destroy me and my family. And I can tell you they tried very hard to do just that. Am I afraid? What more can they do to me?
Well, I'm pretty sure he's not losing sleep at night thinking about falling out of a hotel balcony or that he's going to be a suicide. So there's a difference in kind. Although I'm sure the powers that be can make things hard for him. He had run-ins with Schwarzkopf, and you can go back and see this in the video that I did most recently on him. He had run-ins with Schwarzkopf when he was in the Marines. He had run-ins with Bush the Elder. He had run-ins with Joe Biden, and you saw the Senate testimony in that video where Biden was laying into him, and Biden wasn't very kind when he was laying into him. So he has some experience with this, but it's a difference in order and magnitude when we're talking about what happens in Russia. And yet he still thinks that what Russia has going on is somehow better. It's bizarre.
I'm worried they may try it again. What I know is if I don't do what I'm doing right now, nobody else is going to do it. So I'm not afraid. The thing that I'm impressed about with the Russian people is the seriousness in which they take the work that I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
I'm listening to you and thinking about that you sound naive, surface naive.
Yeah. The problem is, this proves that I'm not. You're not talking to somebody that is a simple academic, and I don't mean to criticize simple academics.
Yeah,
I've
I'm a
been to
simple
war.
academic.
I spent 7 years in Iraq disarming them of weapons of mass destruction. I had
Как
people trying to
военный.
kill me 3 times there. Naive? I went to prison for 3 years because of what I believe in.
Well, it wasn't for what he believed in that he went to prison. And since he raised that, you can look it up and find out what it is. When I've addressed Scott Ritter before, I've stepped around that because I wanted to deal with his arguments, not with why he went to prison and what was going on with that. Because I think we should argue on the merits. And I believe that I can challenge him on the merits and I can show what he actually believes and I can do it fairly. But if you want to look that up, that's a whole different problem set.
There's no naive in this body.
But I mean, you words about let's get together, let's discover Russia's souls, let's try to understand each other.
Well, why don't you come to America with me? And I'll drive you around just my town. And we'll count the Ukrainian flags that are flying from every home.
Now that's a really interesting point because when you drive around in most American towns, you don't see a lot of Russian flags around. In fact, I can't find any in my town or in my neighborhoods or the towns around me. I do see Ukrainian flags on flagpoles, on houses, on bumper stickers, on windows in shops, because there is a wide support for Ukraine in the United States.
We'll count every Ukrainian flag that's flying from every home.
You
Wow,
know,
I see.
I have Ukrainian roots. You know?
I don't know. But you're missing the point. The American people don't know anything about Ukraine. They put the flag up.
And that's interesting. He's about to say they put the flag up, but they don't know anything about Ukraine. But we do know a lot about Ukraine now. And we thought, before February of 2022, we didn't really know a lot. I think that's very fair. But after the invasion, we started paying attention. And we started when Zelensky was saying, I need ammunition, not a ride. And we started going, you know what? There's something here. This guy's standing up for his freedom. And then we realized gradually at least I realized gradually over time, that it wasn't that the people were following Zelensky, it's that Zelensky was part of these people. And these people have a fierce independent streak and they weren't going to bow to tyranny. And but that's what we know now and we weren't paying attention before. I think that's a fair point.
Up just because they makes them feel good. Go to a bar in New York and try and order a Moscow Mule. It's the name of a drink. They don't call it that anymore. They call it the Kiev Kick.
It's pronounced Kiev kick.
Kiev kick.
We can't say Moscow anymore. Go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and look at all the former Russian painters that have been named Ukrainian painters. And when you talk to the American people and you say, why do you do this? They say, well, the Ukrainians believe in freedom.
They do.
Believe in Putin. The Russians.
Well, and that's about right. The Ukrainians are defending their democracy against a foreign aggressor, and Putin is an authoritarian who is trying to trample over them and say they were never a people, they're not a people, they're going to become part of my empire in some way, shape, or form, whether it's an alternative government or I just grab up these oblasts or whatever else, or turn them into a buffer zone or what have you.
Aren't good people because they believe in Putin. Am I really that naive to say that maybe the best way to overcome this ignorance is to talk about who the Russian people are? If you have a better idea, I'm all ears.
Thank you so much.
What is the role of the United Nations in promoting relations between Russia and the United States of America?
The United States wants to control the agenda of the United Nations.
As does Russia.
I mean, just look at the trouble we gave Sergei Lavrov when he tried to fly to New York to chair the Security Council.
And he spent his time when he was chairing the Security Council talking about things that didn't really matter. And the guy that was his ambassador was talking about Russophobia being the problem. It's hardly the problem. So let's be fair and balanced. And I'm not trying to hit back and say the U.S. isn't trying to control the agenda. They are. I think that's fair, just like Russia is.
Delayed the issuance of his visa, and we have harassed him at every step of the way. Anytime Russia wants to discuss an issue of importance, for instance, the presence of American biological research facilities on Ukrainian soil.
Now that's really interesting. When they raise that, they always conflate it with bioweapons rather than medical research. And then it becomes a whole big thing and spins out into the social media biosphere as bioweapons, or they're in Ukraine, and what are they doing with these bioweapons? And it's nothing of the sort.
The United States prevents this. So the United Nations is no longer a viable vehicle of international diplomacy. But the good news is Russia has reached out and is developing effective relations with other nations around the world outside of the framework of the United Nations.
And let me translate that. So the Russians can't play in the international sandbox like they used to. They're cut off from the West, 140 to about 6 in votes in the United Nations, with about 30 staying on the sidelines. As a consequence, they're trying to figure out who to trade with, and so they're relying on the BRICS. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and then other authoritarian regimes with whom they can trade, like Iran and Syria and North Korea. And so that's really what they're doing. They're trying to find alternative means of trade so that they can stay afloat because they're cut off.
The bottom line is, if the American goal was to isolate Russia, to weaken Russia, it's failed.
So I believe he believes this. That's the painful part of this. But it's not true. They have weakened Russia. It hasn't completely cut them off because they find other authoritarians that they can play nicely with. But they're not doing better as a consequence of their invasion.
If the United Nations doesn't find a way to reinvigorate itself, to stop being an agency that can be exploited or used by the United States, diplomacy will find another way to be practiced. And I think Russia's writing the book on that right now.
Yeah, and their method of diplomacy is simply to invade Ukraine and say that they had no choice but to do this and blame the victim for their crime.
Okay,
what kind of an opinion did the soldiers with whom you served have about the Russian army?
Thank you for your question. I assume you're talking about back in the 1980s. We took the Soviet military very seriously. We respected the size of your military. We respected the quality of your equipment. We respected the professionalism of your officers. The reason why I trained so hard for 5 years is because I knew if I didn't, and we went to war against the Soviet Union, I would probably die. So we trained hard because we respected the Soviet soldier.
And that was fair, but the Soviet Union was much, much larger, including the Warsaw Pact, than what Russia is now. It's a fraction of its former self.
We respected the Soviet Army. And I would hope that every American soldier and Marine and sailor and airman who serves today respects the Russian Army in the same way.
And they should be professional and think through that, but they're not the same thing.
Спасибо.
Okay, that's the
Спасибо.
end of his press conference. So I wanted to show that to you because I really believe, like people would say in the other videos, oh, he's just on Russia's payroll, or he's just trying to make money, or he's a grifter or scammer. He's really not. I believe that Scott Ritter really believes this. He's not lying. He's misleading by saying things that are factually incorrect in my estimation, but he's not lying in that way. Okay, if you enjoyed this, please give me a thumbs up or share it. Thank you for the coffees, for the shares, the likes, the subscribes. I really appreciate that. Please share this with somebody who needs to hear both sides of the argument. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you more than anything for caring about Ukraine.